Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to come give a guest lecture for your subject on Aboriginal history. My name is Dwayne Hamacher. I'm an associate professor of cultural astronomy over in the School of Physics, and I work in the world of Indigenous astronomy primarily. I'm sitting in my flat in Yarraville in Bunurong country, so I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people, elders past and present, and extend that recognition to all other Aboriginal, Torres Strait, and First Nations people who'd be joining us today. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic because it's one that is the foundation of most of the work that I do. So working in the world of Indigenous astronomy, what I primarily focus on is looking at the different levels of star knowledge, how the sun, moon, stars, all the various celestial objects and phenomena, how they're encoded in oral tradition, what their meanings are, mostly working for the communities themselves in this regard. But really, I focus a lot on the science of this traditional knowledge, because it's one thing that doesn't often get recognized, is that this knowledge has a pretty intense layer of science, and that science itself is not the product of Western European society and culture. It is, but not exclusively so. It's also part of cultures around the world. And science, like music and art, is a human endeavor. It's something that all cultures develop and utilize and apply. And saying that only Western Europe came up with science would be like saying, well, Western Europe came up with Bach and Beethoven, therefore those are the only types of real music and everything else doesn't count. Well, of course other stuff counts. It's just done differently. It sounds different. But when you look at music across the board, it shares certain fundamental similarities. And that's what the science is about as well that I do. And there's a lot of crossover with that. But I want to focus a little bit less on the science today and focus a little bit more on the history and the archive, what we call the archive, and the issues and problems with that, and the work that we do to try to work with those bodies of knowledge that are encoded within the archive. And then some of the major issues that come out of that and things that I'm still experiencing now with Australian history. So I didn't prepare for this in some formal way, but what I run to do is give some examples about how looking at history in the archive ties in with the work that we're doing on Indigenous astronomy, and highlight some of the ways in which we can learn a lot of new stuff from the historical record, but also having to reconceptualize the historical record, knowing how to critique it, knowing how to analyze it, knowing its limitations and its faults. And this is something that is really quite tricky, because I think in part, Australia and a lot of the Commonwealth, what we call Commonwealth countries, have a very different university system as opposed to what we have in the US. I'm originally from mid-America. I grew up in rural mid-Missouri and moved to Australia when I was 27, just a week before turning 28. And the education system we go through in the US is much more broad. Even though I did my degree in physics, I took a lot of subjects in anthropology and history and archaeology and social sciences and humanities. I didn't just do physics. Whereas in Australia, especially now, the degrees are so narrow in focus and in scope that historians, for example, anybody doing a degree in history or related area, can go through your entire program and never take a subject in science. You might think, well, I'm an historian. What do I care about science? Well, I hope by the end of this lecture, you're going to see why science is so important for people to understand, and why I really personally advocate for the broader degrees. I only found out recently that University of Melbourne used to offer dual degrees, but no longer does that. So people that 10 years ago could do a BA in ancient history and a BSc in physics can't do that anymore. And I find that increasing limitation and that increasing siloing of the disciplines to be one of the foundational problems with everything that we're trying to do, because we live in a world where everything is connected. We live in an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary world. We don't live in a siloed world. And that makes it really difficult when you're trying to cross those worlds over. And that's something that we're doing more and more at an increasing rate. With the Indigenous Knowledges Institute formed at the University of Melbourne, I think they're actually housed in the Faculty of Science, because you want to understand systems of knowledge about the world around us, which is the foundation is what science is. But if you only have people doing that from backgrounds who aren't exposed to any science or minimal amount, I mean, you could argue maybe archaeologists are exposed to a bit more of it because they have to learn a bit of earth science and geography, but and chemistry and things. But broadly, if you focus on only having anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists looking at indigenous knowledges, you're going to be seriously limited in the scope of what you're trying to do. And coming from a background in astrophysics, I did my undergrad in physics in the US, I did my master's in astrophysics at UNSW in Sydney, and then I took a sharp left turn and did a PhD in Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University on Indigenous astronomy. And from the eyes of an astronomer, I was able to approach the research in a totally different way that historians and anthropologists hadn't done. I also learned through my studies the very problematic history of Australia, colonial history of Australia, and obviously the very uncomfortable relationship between anthropology, history, and Indigenous studies. So there's going to be some areas I'd like to talk to you a bit about today and dive into that a bit. So I think one of the most challenging aspects of all this is understanding that traditionally history is all about the written word. I don't technically let's say, history is all about since things were written down. And before that period, it's considered prehistoric, but that concept is really kind of going out the window for good reason. But history does very much still rely on the written record. We can talk about oral history, which is what I'm going to mention now, but that's still a little bit of a different scope from oral tradition. But basically what we're looking at are societies or cultures that commit information either to writing, literacy, or to memory through orality. And Western society places so much emphasis on the written word to the point where we consider anything oral to be myth and legend and fairy tale, which just gets swept up in this basket of pseudoscience and things that can't be relied on. And it's, everything is about the written word. But orality doesn't work the way that so many people think that it does. Everybody always cites this ridiculous game that they have everybody do when we're in grade school or primary school, which I don't like the term they use here. And in the US, we call it telephones, where you get the students in a row and you tell the student a phrase at one and they've got to repeat it. And by the time it gets to the end, it's changed because there's always some smart ass student in the middle of the class who's got to say something obscene or whatever. And, it's the most unreliable way of trying to describe orality because there's no rules, there's no framework, and it's one person to one person. Whereas in an oral system, you've got a whole structure around that where there's reward for doing it correctly, punishment for doing it incorrectly, where your survival depends on it. Whereas in a classroom, who cares? It's a goofy exercise that almost feels meaningless. And when you look at concepts of orality and oral tradition, we see how the brain has evolved to necessitate committing information to memory. We're very bad at writing things down and remembering things that are written down. We can't remember a long list of dry, boring facts. That's why we put them in encyclopedias and books. But if you have a system around that where it's intergenerational, where information is being passed down, sometimes in very strict and formalized ways, like through initiation, where you're required to memorize huge quantities of information and recite it exactly on cue, exactly the way you were taught it. When you have those systems in place, you find that oral tradition can last for an extremely long period of time. That's what I'm going to talk about first. But if you don't have that, then our memories are pretty much shot these days. We just use these damn things to look stuff up. You know, we go to the University of Google for information, which is very problematic. So what I'm getting at is in the area of Aboriginal history, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but in the work that I'm doing on traditional knowledge, you're taking information that has been passed down orally, that's encoded in that particular language, filtered through the eyes of overwhelmingly non-Indigenous people, written in a totally different language with, you know, all of their bias and motivations behind that. And then later on, we go back to that information in the archive, and we're trying to dig through that, sort it out, and help figure things out. And it's extremely problematic because there's all kinds of errors and conflations and mistakes riddled throughout. So we have to set up these frameworks and these methodologies for how to analyze the archive and how to approach it. And that can be really tricky because obviously you would have learned about the initial and ongoing effects of colonization and how devastating they have been and continue to be now. In places like the major cities in particular, where colonization was the most, well, I might want to say the most complete, the knowledge and traditions and language was fragmented to such a degree where not a whole lot is remaining in a structured, formalized way. And this is something that elders talk to me about all the time when they invite me to work with them on a project relating to their star knowledge or their astronomy. And says, look, we want to learn more about our star knowledge. A lot has been fragmented. There's pretty much no elders who have all of the information, but there are people who have stories here and there. And we want you to come in and help us try to piece it all together. And I utilize the three basic approaches to that, but with the eyes and the background of the scientists. And that by no means means that it's complete or that's the best way to do it. It's just bringing a different approach to what's been done before. So the three main ways are history, archaeology, and anthropology at the end of the day, and linguistics to a degree, if there's enough of the language that's still surviving. And in some communities, it's, you know, the information is still quite strong. In some communities, the information is highly fragmented. But the historical part is going back through the archives and through the literature to find all the information we can, you know, for, in my case, about astronomy, anything relating to the sun, moon, stars, whatever. What can we find in the archive? We gather all that together, and then we try to do our analysis through that. Lots of methodologies that we develop, frameworks we develop, and theories we utilize in cultural astronomy to help piece this stuff back together the best we can. But it's like a giant puzzle where you're missing most of the pieces. You can get a little bit of an idea, but you're going to be missing a lot of information. Then we do what they call the ethnographic or the anthropological component, where we actually sit with the elders and we learn from them. And then a lot of times they'll be providing information that can help fill more of those gaps. And then we look at the tangible, the physical sites, the cultural heritage, the tangible heritage, material culture, anything that might be relating to the stars. And we can also fill in some more gaps with that. And we're never going to have a picture as complete as it was before colonization. It's just, in most cases, not possible. But we can come up with a result that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's by utilizing the techniques and the methodologies that we've developed in this particular space to help understand how the stars link to things, how they link to the behavior of the animals, the changing of seasons, you know, planting gardens or harvesting or gathering, hunting, whatever, food economics, as well as ceremony. All those things all tie together, and they're all informed by the stars. So when we're doing this, we have to go through and consider the ideas of orality. We learn the stories from oral tradition. And the stories serve a number of functions, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this because I'm not. But what I have learned is that if you've got a lot of information about the world around you and you need to commit it to memory, you do that primarily through the method of loci. And that's about connecting memory to place. but you also have to develop narratives about that. So you show how things are interlinked, and you create a story that weaves all of that together. And that story has to have memorable components to it. It can't be a boring story. None of us will remember boring things. So the stories often have, not to sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but it'll have supernatural causation, superhuman feats of strength, humans morphing into animals coming out of the sky. There's sex and violence and all those kinds of things that are going to be memorable. And the stories take that information about the world around us, also with all the social laws and strata within that, and they put that together into these narratives. And these narratives are multi-layered. They have multiple purposes. Some of it describes real stuff, some of it's allegorical, some of it's symbolic. There's this whole range of things that if you're somebody trying to go through and understand that, you've got to sort of sift through these things to get an idea of how it works. That knowledge is also not just the story, but committed to song and to dance. Humans are phenomenal at being able to put things to the tune of music and remember that. I mean, I can remember, sometimes I'll be in a Coles or Woolies, and because I was born in the late 70s, I'm a Gen Xer, the music I grew up with is now the music they're playing in bloody Coles and Woolies all the time. And sometimes some song will come on that I haven't heard since the 80s, and I remember the lyrics to it right away, which surprises me at times because it's been 25, 30 odd years now since I even heard the song, and I remember it. So dance is also a way of acting out that information. So you see the dances, maybe linking to an animal, and they're mimicking the movements of the animal. It's not just about mimicking the movements of an animal, but it's understanding how the animals move and how that relates to the information in the song that's also encoded in your old tradition. And that's all tied in with all the material culture, the engineering and the craft and those things, the social practices, the traditional law, and of course, all of that is embedded within the knowledge systems. So basically, a big part of what I'm doing when I'm working for the communities is to go back through all the historical and archival information, everything that's been written down and recorded in some way or another, whether it's a journal in a museum, or it's been a published book or a newspaper article, anything of that nature. It's all information that we've got to take in and try to sort through. And part of that is about what we call the archaeology of orality. And this is a weird area where history ties in very closely. And this also links in with the concept of the longevity of orality. How long can this oral tradition or these oral traditions be passed down in time? A couple of things that are important to remember, which ties in directly with the history when you're looking at traditional knowledge systems. Traditional knowledge systems are not static, they are dynamic. They do change, they evolve. It is information about the world around us, and the world around us does not stay static. Ice ages come and go, the ocean levels rise and fall, plate tectonics, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, all that stuff happens all the time. Meteorite impacts, stuff in the sky changes. The stars shift in their positions in the sky because of precession of equinoxes and nutation and proper motion, and all these things are happening all the time, usually on slower time scales. But there are going to be elements of events that have happened that are going to survive an oral tradition relatively unchanged. Maybe details about other elements of the narrative will change to accommodate that new information. But there are going to be elements of those traditions that still remain embedded within that narrative. And those can last for extremely long periods of time. And when we're looking at the archaeology of orality, it's a couple of different ways we can think about that. We can look at, how long can these oral traditions last is probably not a question a lot of Aboriginal people would ask, because it is a very linear timeline of events that we're thinking of, and that's very much a Western construct. But also the world around us is a series of cycles of different time scales, and those cycles overlap like a giant complex Venn diagram. And where those areas overlap are anchor points that we can utilize to show how these things synchronize together. And when we're looking at the idea of how long can these oral traditions last, that helps us to understand elements of history, even oral history or written history. Because the oral traditions do talk about things in an allegorical and a symbolic fashion. They also talk about things in a very real, literal sense. And we know that because we can see how directly related they are. And we can look at natural events like an earthquake or volcanic eruption or a tsunami or a meteorite impact or a supernova. And we have traditions about those things. And those traditions exactly describe how those events would have occurred and how they passed. You know, up here I've got a picture of a solar eclipse. And there are lots of traditions about solar eclipses from around Australia, even though total solar eclipses only occur from a given location once every few hundred years. They're extremely rare events. But the way they're described in oral tradition allows that information to be passed down through several generations. And you may go a few generations before one of those events is even seen again. Keeping in mind that not only do eclipses only occur once every few hundred years, but they only last for a few minutes. And you've got traditions about eclipses from areas that haven't witnessed a total solar eclipse in over 1,000 years. So it gives you a new way of thinking about the power of orality. So one of the ways that researchers like myself try to understand this question about the longevity of oral tradition is by looking at the archaeology of orality and thinking about, well, if they are described, the traditions are describing natural events that occurred in the past, we're going to make the assumption that they're a literal representation or a literal description of the event or the the event or the natural conditions at a particular point in time, and that it's not symbolic or allegorical. Then there should be modern scientific ways of testing that to date those events to figure out how long it's been since those things happened. And this is where a lot of the historical stuff in the archive comes from. So we can think of the terminus postquem or the terminus antequem. This is the limit after which something makes sense or something would have been viable, and the before which. So there could be, let's say, a meteorite impact, like Henbury. So this is out in the central desert, about 120 kilometers south of Alice Springs. This small asteroid came barreling into the atmosphere. It broke apart because of the pressure in the atmosphere and hit the ground and created, 15 or 16 of these big craters ranging in size. And there are lyric traditions that talk about the fire devil running down from the sun, hitting the land, turning it into fire, killing everyone, and creating all these big holes. And the asteroid was made of nickel and iron, which is one of the main types of meteorites or asteroids in space. And the people talked about how one of the craters you can see here in the image, which has a creek running into it and lots of trees inside, during rain events that would actually fill up with water. And the people said that, we don't go and collect water from that, even though it would be a great resource, because, in our traditions, if we do that fire devil is going to come down and fill it with iron again. There's a very clear oral tradition of this impact that has survived for how long? Well, we can use radiometric dating techniques of geology and find that it's on the order of 4,500 years old. So those oral traditions have been passed down for over 4,000 years. And they give a very detailed and accurate description of this. That's how we know that this wasn't symbolic or allegorical. That's quite literal because we can see it. We know, we can look at it and tell this is how it formed. And that's exactly what the traditions tell us. And we can see even, so the terminus, we had terminus postquem and terminus antequem. So if we had a terminus antequem of 4,200 years, it means before that time, the conditions would have been right for this. So this would have formed before that time period, not after. We can look at going up to Queensland, around the rainforest there. There's a few of these beautiful lakes, Lake Eacham, Lake Bering, that are formed by volcanism. And these formed when magma under the Earth's crust started pushing its way to the surface, and it superheated the water in the water table. And like boiling water, created pressure, just like a steam engine, and caused it to explode out of the ground. And when it eventually cooled, that water formed these beautiful crater lakes. And the Aboriginal traditions talk about the formation of these crater lakes, of being about how the ground exploded and created fire and destruction, and people drowned, and that's where these holes were formed. So they actually described this particular event that formed these craters, which the terminus antiquam, like, is over 9,000 years ago. That's how long it's been since this event occurred. But what's even more interesting about this particular case is that one of the elders who was talking to an anthropologist back, or a linguist actually, back in the 1960s, I think it was, said that when this happened, the area wasn't the rainforest we see today. Before that, it was just scrub, eucalypt scrub. It was after that that scientists did core samples out of the bottom of the crater, and they found pollen in the core samples that showed when this crater lake was formed, it wasn't rainforest at the time, it was eucalypt scrub. And that ties into the very tail end of the last ice age, when the sea levels began rising, and there's all kinds of oral traditions about the sea levels rising. Patrick Nunn and a linguist named Reed published a paper looking at oral traditions all around the coast of Australia and seeing all the traditions that talk about the ocean levels rising and linking to landforms that are now underwater. Down here in Melbourne, Port Phillip, Narm, was dry land at one point, and the Bunurong traditions talk about how the ocean came in and flooded the bay, and actually dried up again and flooded again. But it talked about the river courses where they used to be, and scientists went and looked, did scour the bottom of the bay, not literally scoured, but like using sonar and whatever techniques they were using, and found the old courses of the rivers are exactly as they're described in oral tradition. So it tells us about how long these oral traditions have been passed down, how long this oral history can last. And when the colonists started going across the country, whether they were missionaries or farmers or, proper ethnographers, academically trained ethnographers and anthropologists, writing all this information down, they're writing it down from the Aboriginal people. They're writing it down in English in most cases. If they write it down in traditional language, in most cases, there's not always a really detailed understanding of the language. And they write things down in their reference frame, in their terms, that of the non-Indigenous ethnographers and whoever it happens to be. And this is where so many of the mistakes can come in, and ideas get conflated, terms get conflated. In astronomy, planet and star, meteor and comet, those things get conflated all the time. If you're not an astronomer, you might think, well, so what, who cares? Well, it actually makes a huge difference. And if you're in a position like I am, and I'm working for the community to help them basically reconstruct some of their lost knowledge relating to the stars, or I shouldn't say lost, but fragmented. Some of it's lost, some of it survived, some of it's fragmented. It's critically important that the information I'm giving back to the elders in the community is as accurate as possible. And I may not assign a lot of meaning to something. That doesn't mean the community doesn't assign meaning to it. So we have to be very rigorous in how we do this and ensure everything is accurate. Because if we don't, we can feed false information back to communities. And that false information can be taken back by the communities as fact. Well, it's been through this university system. Here are these professors who did all this work, and they're telling us this is what it means. This must be right. In a lot of cases, it's not. And I see this happening in ecology, in meteorology, in astronomy, in geology, all these areas where that information is just wrong. It's just flat out wrong. And not only can that be problematic when academics are giving that information back to the communities after entrusting us, working with them to go through it. It used to be a situation where the academics would do it, and usually it was little or no consultation with the elders of community. Now it's a constant consultation with the elders in the community. But I've sat with a number of elders, particularly in the Torres Strait, with the information, the knowledge is still very strong, but it's also still fragmented. And I've had elders sit with me and say, well, look, our parents and uncles and aunties taught us this stuff when we were younger, but I didn't pay much attention. I was too busy thinking about other things. I wish I'd paid more attention, because now there's a lot of that stuff that's a big gap in their memory. And some elders will know a lot about how to read certain stars, how to interpret the changes in their position and properties, but couldn't sit outside and tell me what stars they're specifically talking about, like a constellation or something. And this becomes a challenge. So I've got to work with the communities to sort of build all this together. And I have to rely on the archive to help fill in some of those gaps. And because of all these mistakes in the archive, I mean, I've found tons of them just through the eyes of an astronomer alone. And when I'm working with the communities, this ongoing consultation process, I've got to explain to them, well, I found the archive gives 4 different stars for this one that you call the Dogai. And I'll sit and explain to them what we're doing, and they're like, well, they'll agree with me that this one makes the most sense, and we'll sort of come together on that. But it's a collaboration. So when you're working in history, in Australian history, with traditional knowledge systems, that collaboration, that process is so important. But it's also really important that you have some kind of background knowledge and information to be able to even help interpret it in the first place. Otherwise, as an historian, you can only focus on certain historical aspects. If you're looking at traditional knowledge, for example, and you've got no scientific background whatsoever, there's going to be a lot of challenges and problems that you're going to face. And what I want to talk about now is something else that's come out of this. And that has been how the history and philosophy of science itself is being challenged and changed now by going back and reanalyzing these historical documents about traditional Aboriginal culture in Australia that are in the archive. And to some, it might not seem like a big deal. I'm having that challenge right now with some historians. I'm trying to publish papers in history journals, and the historians in some cases say, well, I don't understand any of the astronomy, so we're not going to accept the publication. You should publish it in an astronomy journal. I'm like, no, this is for you. You're the historians. You're the ones I'm talking to. Don't just say because you don't understand some aspect of it to just not do it. You need to educate yourselves on it. I'm an astrophysicist who had to educate myself on how to do astronomy and archaeology and anthropology. I've still got a lot to learn. By no means am I at some finish line. But you have to make that effort to try to learn and understand it. You can't just dismiss it and say, well, I don't know anything about that, so screw it. That's not how we're going to make real meaningful change. That's not where we're going to find innovation. We're going to find that through the crossroads of these disciplines. And one of the traditions I'm going to talk to you about right now is exactly in line with that. And this story, I'm not really a storyteller. I'm not going to really sit here and try to tell a story, but I'm going to try to talk to you about the base elements of a narrative, how information is encoded in that narrative, how the historians and archaeologists and anthropologists wrote it down and interpreted it, and then what we're seeing today and how we're having to reconsider that, reanalyze that, and then what that's telling us about. So one of the stories is about Wayangari. This is from the Ngarrindjeri people of the Coorong, south of Adelaide, right at the mouth of the Murray River in South Australia. And there's lots of different variations of the story, but they've all got the same general theme and same thread going throughout. And they talk about Wayangari being a young man, an initiate, probably mid-teens, going through initiation, and there's a period of time where he is in this sacred space called Narambi. And during that period of time, he can't wear any clothes, he has to fast, he's got to have, he's got to prove himself and go through these various restrictions. And part of that means that he's not wearing any clothing, he's covered in red ochre, he can't eat any food, he can drink water, of course, but he's not allowed to have contact with anybody else, especially women. And the basic narrative goes that he was down by a river or one of the freshwater lakes, and he took a reed and was bending down in the water to drink water from the reed. And some of the ochre splashed in the water, and the water was moving, so it carried it downstream a little ways. And two women saw the ochre in the water, and they were wondering where it came from. So they sort of snuck around, and they saw Wayangari. And they thought, ooh, hello, attractive young man covered in ochre. And they basically followed him back to his home that night. He went into his house, and went to sleep. And the two women morphed into emus and began making the sound of the emus. And knowing that he's a hunter, knowing that would draw him out. So he come running out, with the spear in hand, ready to attack. And they morphed back into the women. And the three of them went into their hut, and I'll leave it up to your imagination what happened, but let's just say he broke traditional law. Those two women were also the wives of his brother. Now, for some people that may seem strange, but because of the different marriage systems, usually when you reach a particular age, certain members of the family become taboo for you, and that was the case. So, don't know if he didn't recognize them or whatever the reason was, they did something they weren't supposed to be doing. His older brother, Nepali, found out about what had happened and tried to set the hut on fire while the three of them were asleep inside. He was that enraged. But they woke up in time, they managed to escape, and knowing that they were going to face punishment or face death as their punishment, either from his enraged brother or from the fact that they broke really strict taboos, he cast a spear into the Milky Way, and he pulled himself and the two women up into the Milky Way to become a bright red star. And the traditions say, or what the anthropologists wrote down from the elders and the community members, is that every year in the springtime, this star is high above with his two wives. He's in the celestial canoe with the emu off to the east, the emu being the great emu in the sky. It's a dark constellation traced out by the dark spaces in the Milky Way. And that every once in a while, Wayangari grows hotter and brighter. And this signifies the start of spring when the animals begin mating, everything's coming out of winter. And it's his brightening signals a warning to the people to follow traditional law and not break taboo, especially with anything sexual. Now, the anthropologist who wrote this down said, oh, well, it's a red star in the sky. It must be Mars, the planet Mars. And they wrote this down. And when they asked a couple of the elders if it was Mars, the elders were like, yeah, it's Mars. And they even, in their books, this is Ronald and Catherine Berndt, famous anthropologists. So they've written all these books, which become part of the historical archive. And they even drew in star maps, labeling everything. And other anthropologists over time have written about this and repeated this story. Even astronomers who were working in this space, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, were sort of rehashing the same thing that was written. Wayangari is Mars, and this is what he means. There's even a couple of artists who make artwork about this story, and they sell it. It's on coffee mugs and T-shirts and pillows, and neckties, whenever you go to museums. And it's a challenge and it's a problem because if you're not an astronomer, well, this seems to make sense. If you're an astronomer, you're going, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. Mars is a planet. By definition, planets, the name planetos means wandering star. They're always moving around. Planets are not one of the distant stars. They're nearby. We're all moving around the sun. These are things that move around the sky all the time. It's not going to be in the same spot, in the same part of the sky at the same time of the year, every year. It's just not going to be. Not to mention, it didn't make any sense. Like, who were the two sisters? And other anthropologists, they tried coming up with these ideas. Oh, it's actually two other planets, and every once in a while they all come together, and they're creating all this weird symbolism around it that didn't make any sense. And a colleague of mine, who is an anthropologist, had written this big paper reviewing the story of Wayangari, all the different variations of it. And a few years ago, he sent me his paper, and he says, look, I'm not convinced Mars is the object they're talking about here. What do you think? I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't really read anything about the story. And I'm going through this, And you know, these are anthropologists who are writing information down, but like I said, it becomes part of the historical archive. And I'm reading through, and I'm like, well, it's obviously not Mars. I don't know why they think it's Mars. It makes no sense. Here's 18 reasons why it's very clearly the star Antares. And the two stars on either side are Tau and Cygnus Scorpii. These are the two women. This is the celestial canoe. It talks about the celestial canoe being this constellation, which in Western astronomy is Scorpius. The emu in the sky is towards the bottom of the page, towards the Southern Cross. This all fits perfectly. And we know that what people want to call springtime now, August, really in September, this group of stars, this star in particular, is high overhead, basically crossing the meridian just after sunset at that time of the year. Well, okay, so this is Antares, so this makes more sense. I don't know why they thought it was Mars. And when you do work with Aboriginal communities, you find out, especially, back in late 1800s, early 1900s, whenever an anthropologist would ask an elder something, there might be a few reasons they would get responses that that might be wrong. Maybe they're trying to put you off the trail because you're starting to go into territory that's very sacred and secret. They don't want you knowing about it. Maybe they feign interest and pretend they don't know. Or in some cases, when they come and ask you a question, because of the power dynamic, they're like, yeah, they're going to agree with pretty much anything you say. Not because they necessarily agree, but because the power dynamic, especially back in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, really not a good environment for that. You didn't, there was this whole power dynamic where you didn't really disagree with them when they came and asked you a question like that. If a mission manager or whatever came up and asked you a question. So that ties into the colonial history of Australia really prominently. And it shows a lot of the really challenging, problematic issues with that. Not always the case, of course, but that does tend to happen. I mean, I don't know the reason that Mars was confirmed, but it's not Mars. It's very clearly Antares, which is kind of funny because in Western science, Antares means the rival or anti-Ares. Ares is the Greek god of war. Mars is the Roman god of war. They're both bright red. They're both about the same brightness. And because the ecliptic, the path of the sun, moon, and the planets goes through Scorpius, which is why it's one of the constellations of the zodiac, Scorpio, sometimes these two objects are near each other in the sky and they're rivals fighting for dominance. And a very small percentage of stars in the sky are red. So red stars always had a very special significance. But what's interesting here is that when the anthropologists said that, well, Wayangari brightening over time, or and fading again, is Mars, because sometimes Mars is close to us in the solar system, sometimes it's further away. Therefore, sometimes it's going to be brighter, sometimes it's going to be fainter. But it's not Mars, it's Antares. So what? Well, turns out Antares is a variable star. It's a star by its own inherent structure, pulsates in time. And when it pulsates and gets bigger, it gets brighter. And when it shrinks a bit, it gets a bit fainter. And this change in brightness between its brightest point and its faintest point is not small. It's about 1.5 magnitudes, which in astronomy terms is very noticeable. The time scale is about 4.5 years. So what this means is this star actually changes by a considerable degree of brightness every few years. Now, this is really cool if you're an astronomer. If you're an historian or an anthropologist, you're thinking, well, so what? Well, this changes the history of science because it's people like John Herschel who were credited for discovering the variability of these really bright, large, giant red stars in the 1840s. So the history of science says the variability of these stars was discovered by, white European male scientists in the 1800s. When you've got Aboriginal traditions that have been talking about this for who knows how long, centuries, millennia, who knows, for a very long period of time. So who discovered it? Well, we may not know who the first person in all of human history was to discover it. We know that Aboriginal people knew about it before Western scientists did. And this isn't the only case of it. We also, the exact same sort of situation happened in the Central Desert with the star Betelgeuse and Aldebaran. Basically, there's a Seven Sisters narrative about the 7 young sisters of the Pleiades and the bright star or the constellation of Orion, which is Niruna, pursuing them and their elder sister is the V shape of stars called the Hyades. Um, and basically what happened is Nairun is actually upside down in the sky. The traditions talk about him being upside down, the same orientation as his Greek counterpart, because from the southern hemisphere, what the Greeks saw, we see down here as being upside down. Curious, they say that the young sisters were afraid of Nairuna, that he was a womanizer, they were too young for him anyway. Their eldest sister knew that he's really a coward at heart despite all of his posturing, so she stands in the way to protect her sisters from Nairuna. And he gets very frustrated at her because he wants to get to the younger girls. So he creates fire magic in his right hand, the red star, Betelgeuse. And he tries to throw that fire to get Kambugata out of the way. Well, she creates fire on her left foot. So that V shape of stars is basically her standing in front of Nairuna, trying to draw his attention away and then making fun of him. So he's basically, giving him this. She creates fire magic in her left foot in Aldebaran and kicks sand into his face, which humiliates him. And then his fire magic in his hand dies down again. But because he's a man that doesn't take no for an answer, he comes back with fire magic again. And when this happens a second time, she calls on Baba, the father dingo, which comes and grabs Nairuna and shakes him and attacks him. And when he's doing this, all the other stars around are twinkling and laughing and mocking Nairuna. And then the elder sister places a row of dingo puppies in front of her, between her and Nairuna, to protect her. Well, because they're dingo puppies, it's kind of a sign of humiliation for Nairuna. So there's this whole dynamic, and there's a whole lot more to the narrative that I can't go into. But it talks, the fundamental thing that I'm getting at here is Betelgeuse and Aldebaran getting brighter and fading over time. And this is exactly the same as Antares. These are both variable stars. Betelgeuse varies by about a magnitude every, 400 days, so a bit over a year. And Aldebaran is a very weird star. It's a red giant as well, but its period of variability and its changes in brightness are very small and kind of random. But what the tradition was clearly describing was Betelgeuse changing in brightness over time, and possibly even Aldebaran changing in brightness, but then not doing so at the same rate, which is why the second time, after she's fought Nairuna one time, the second time she has to call on Baba, the father dingo, because she can't create the fire magic on her foot. This was recorded in the late 1800s, or actually mid 1800s. And John Herschel, a famous astronomer in South, he's an Englishman, but he was in South Africa at the time, had discovered the variability of Betelgeuse, even though it had already long been known to Aboriginal people. And he was the one who's credited for this discovery. And to this day, people still argue that he's the one who should be credited. Why? Because it's written down. He actually wrote it down as opposed to passing it in oral tradition, which is one of the big problems that we face in this work, that the focus and the credit is given to things that are written down and not to things that are in oral tradition. Because oral tradition is considered myth and legend and fairy tales, some kind of implication that it has no basis in reality, when that isn't the case. So these are challenging the history of science and basically rewriting that. And this whole idea about rewriting history, we rewrite history every single day, so what? But I don't want to give this sort of, thing you see in the media about we have to rewrite all the textbooks. We rewrite textbooks all the damn time. That's why there's always new issues, new versions, new editions coming out. That's why we do the work that we're doing. But what I'm getting at with all of this is that we have to critically consider the archive, however you want to define it, the written record, particularly when it's written down by non-Indigenous people, not in traditional language. It's filled with all these errors and conflations and mistakes and stuff. And that's why it takes interdisciplinary scholarship, like anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists, working with scientists and of course, at all times working with the elders and communities to help approach this in new and innovative ways. What's even better is when you have people from those communities, when you have those Aboriginal communities coming into this space, and they're walking that line between these two different worlds. What First Nations people, Mi'kmaq in the US, or in Canada, in the US, call two-eyed seeing. It's seeing the world with one eye through an Indigenous lens and one eye through a Western science lens and finding the innovation between the two areas. Not something I can do, obviously, because I only come from one of those worlds. But this is the new direction of scholarship in this area. And that's why it's so important that as historians or people studying history, we have to critically critique and analyze and consider all this information. And despite the legal system, which is based on the written word, just because something is written down doesn't necessarily make it right. Just because something is written down doesn't mean it's written in stone, as we like to say colloquially. We have to reconsider this. We have to think of it in new and innovative ways. And to finish on one more point, I haven't got to nearly as much stuff in this lecture as I wanted to, but that's okay, is that we can actually develop new scholarship that can lead to new discoveries in science by merging these two areas together. An example of that comes from some of the oral traditions that have been written down from Arnhem Land. And one of them talks about two brothers who were fishing in a canoe out at sea. They were so busy fishing, they didn't notice storm clouds coming in the distance, even though they were warned against that by some of the elders. They said that, even though the sky is perfectly clear now, you need to be paying close attention because storms can seem to come out of nowhere, and they just sort of ignored it. So a social lesson in this as well, of course. But when they saw the storm clouds coming, they began paddling back to shore as fast as they could, but the storm came too quickly, it capsized the canoe. The older brother saved the younger brother at the expense of his own life. And after the storm, the younger brother, was alive on the shore, and the canoe was capsized. People ran down when they saw the canoe. They found the younger brother who was alive, and he told them what happened. And later on, they found the older brother's body washing up on shore. And they decided to hold a special ceremony honoring the heroism of the older brother. And the traditions talk about how a short time later, a bright new star appeared on the bank of the Sky River. And that new star was telling the people that the older brother was safe with the ancestors in the sky, in the afterworld, as a way of oversimplifying it. And that later on, when the younger brother lived to be a very old man, before he was about to die, he asked the ancestors to place him in the sky with his brother. So the ancestors placed him and his brother into the sky as the stars, Western science called Shala and Lasath. These are the two stars in the stinger of Scorpius. So if I just go back, it's these two stars right here, Shala and Lasath. This is the older brother, this is the younger brother. And this story is quite interesting because it talks about a bright new star appearing in the sky pretty suddenly that wasn't there later on. Otherwise, they wouldn't have chosen these two stars here. Like, it seemed like they had to pick a new star for the older brother to be there and have the younger brother join him. Well, what's very interesting is that about 1600 years ago, a bright new star did appear in that exact part of the sky. It's called the supernova of 393. It was recorded by cultures across Asia, and particularly in China. And they talk about how this bright star appeared right on the edge of the light and dark spaces in the Milky Way. Now, keeping in mind that the Sky River is the Milky Way, and on the banks of the Sky River, the dark spaces was the water and the bright spaces was the land. So when they say it occurred on the banks of the Sky River, that meant right on the edge of that light and dark boundary. So you've got that exact part of the sky, that exact part of that part of the sky. So it's in the Milky Way. It's right near the stars of Shala and Lasath. And you have an indication that at the time of year, when the sky can go from being very clear to being very cloudy and stormy, happens really at a specific time of the year. And that is when this constellation is high in the sky after sunset. And the elders will talk about how fishermen will still look to these stars now, and they'll see the reflections of the brothers in the water as a warning not to go out too far into sea to go fishing, for example. So you've got this whole narrative built up around this. And this is an actual supernova. This became one of the brightest objects in the sky for about 8 months before it faded away to invisibility, which explains why the star shell on the south became the two brothers. So there are other stories around Australia about new objects, bright stars appearing in the sky. And astronomers are finding the remnants of these supernova, these dead stars, and trying to figure out how long ago they occurred. And some of them would have occurred in the last 10,000 years or so. So this is now an area where Aboriginal elders and astrophysicists are working together to try to figure out, well, where can we point our telescopes, or what do your stories talk about? And we can actually find the astrophysical signature of this event in time. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was a literal event. You know, it could have been a symbolic event, but when it happens to be that exact part of the sky that was visible at that time of the year that the story was discussing, a bright new star appears and then fades away, it doesn't seem like it was, you know, allegorical or symbolic. It seems to be describing an actual literal event, natural event. So in the end of all this lecture, what I hope that everybody can get a bit of a better idea about is the importance of interdisciplinarity, especially in areas like history and anthropology and archaeology, which all three work very closely together. It's about understanding the limitations and problems in the archive. And just because you see something written down doesn't mean that it's exactly right or even right at all. It highlights the critical importance of ongoing and continuous collaboration with the communities and the elders who have this knowledge, usually by their invitation, of course, and why it's so important that we need to consider this stuff in a different light, because an historian or an anthropologist who may not understand the astronomy or the meteorology or the ecology behind something doesn't mean it isn't important. It's extremely important. In fact, it's critically important. And that again ties in with the idea of interdisciplinary scholarship. But also we can now look at the ways in which these two worlds come together to find innovative new solutions to some of the problems that we're facing, and help think about research in very different ways, in more inclusive and mutually respectful ways. So I hope that's what we can take away from the lecture today. There's a publication that I've just submitted to an astronomy journal after getting rejected from a history journal for this exact same reason. And I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to share a preprint of that with you, which I haven't posted online yet. So you're going to be privileged to be the first people outside of our immediate group who are going to see this publication. And it talks about geological and astronomical events described in Tasmanian oral traditions that converge at 13,000 years ago. So thank you so much for inviting me to come and give a guest lecture. I obviously want to pay respect to the Yolngu and the Ngarrindjeri people whose traditions I've been talking about here. I'm by no means an expert in any of that. I'm simply trying to show everybody the importance of considering the archive and the importance of history being very interdisciplinary and being very collaborative with those communities and those elders. So thank you very much.